So I can vaguely remember in the early 2000s when we watched shows like Idols or Britain's Got Talent or America's Got Talent or South Africa's Got Talent. If you wanted to win the competition, you had to sing very well. So either you had to sing very well or you had to be very attractive, and it usually worked on a bit of a sliding scale. So if you didn't sing very well, then you had to be very attractive, and if you were very attractive, then you could afford some false notes. These days, however, just as Frikkie or the contestant is about to take the stage, the host will tell us, let's get to know Frikkie a little bit better. At that moment, we cut to his house and the music tells us that something tragic happened. And we'll quickly learn that there were financial hardships, or we'll look at photos of somebody, a relative or a dog that died. By the time that we are back on stage and Frikkie is about to sing, there's not a dry eye left in the building. And that tells us something about our culture. You see, for Frikkie to be relatable to our modern audience, he has to be a victim of some sort. Now, when I watch the latest Soccer World Cup, I find it very amusing that they would just theatrically dive when there's almost no contact with the particular player. And he would dive to the ground and hold on to his shin and just scream to high heavens, only to miraculously recover when their side is either rewarded a penalty or play goes on. Now, it dawned on me that as South Africans, and the world for that matter, we are actually all soccer players. We are all divers. You see, white people would say that they are being victimized in the workplace through racist and oppressive systems like black economic empowerment and quota systems and affirmative action, etc. Black people would dive and hold on to their shin and scream to high heavens by saying that they have been, for the last 400 years, they have been the victim of systemic racism. You'll have Indian and colored people saying that they weren't white enough in apartheid, they're not black enough now. Everybody in this country seems to be a victim. And it's not just in South Africa where this is actually the case. So in Trump's America, the right would say that they are the victims of radical political correctness, and the Black Lives Matter guys would say that they are allegedly on the receiving end of violence, systemic and physical violence. And it's not just a race thing these days. You'll see men saying that they have to play on a field of eggshells, they have to play their soccer, and women who we would say me too, and they demand that a soccer team called Patriarchy be expelled from the game. And it's not just a gender thing. You'll have the LGBTQIA plus team struggling to decide on a team name, but they want to play or dive as well. So the result is everybody in this world seems to be a victim. Now, how on earth did we arrive at this point? How did this victim apocalypse happen? How did the virus spread so quickly? Because we live in a very strange time where it seems that the most powerful word in the English language today is "I am offended." Now that is interesting. That reveals something about our culture. And the only thing better than being right is being wronged. So how did we arrive at this very strange juncture? Now, a French guy, Pascal Bruckner, and he's French, so I probably just butchered his name. He ventures a guess. He says that the modern obsession with victimhood probably stems from Auschwitz, the Holocaust. So in 1945, when Nazi Germany was defeated and images started to circulate of the concentration camps and the horrors that happened there, understandably, a massive sympathy across the world was directed towards the Jewish people. For the first time, we saw murder on an industrial scale. And 3 years later, only 3 years later, the State of Israel was declared. Now, there's something interesting that happens there. Bruckner came to the conclusion that there's a very real link between being a victim and political power. He makes the following quite provocative claim. He says this: Auschwitz has become the gold standard of human suffering. It has become a monstrous object of covetous lust. He said, when we thought of the Jews historically, we used to feel sorry for them, but today we don't feel sorry for them, we envy them. A very provocative claim. He says Auschwitz has become the gold standard for human suffering. It has become a monstrous object of covetous lust. What people want is to clothe themselves in its moral eminence, in its tragic splendor. Suffering gives one rights. It is even the sole source of rights. Anyone who seizes control of it also seizes power. The great superiority of unhappiness over happiness is that it provides a destiny. It alone enthrones us in a new aristocracy of the outcast. One has to display one's own distress and, if possible, eclipse that of one's neighbor in order to be recognized as the most meritorious. So he's saying there's a very direct link between suffering, between victimhood and power. He goes on to say, heirs traditionally referred to children from good families who enjoyed a large fortune and a good education. But today the word refers to a transmission of a new patrician value, suffering, which raises us to an unprecedented aristocratic order. How then can we avoid transforming ourselves into lobbies of professional sufferers competing with others for a market share in the martyr's crown? Now this leads to an interesting situation. If being a victim leads to political power, then guess who's going to be a victim? Everyone. And it leads to a very bizarre situation. It means that you've got white people in South Africa claiming that there is a very specific genocide being directed against whites in South Africa, and therefore they seek amnesty in places like Canada. You have feminists arguing or protesting against the latest war epic Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, because there weren't enough women in the movie. You have Google saying that they are more inclusive by removing half an egg from the salad emoji in order to make it more inclusive towards vegans. You have a white hippie being called a racist because of a cultural appropriation because he wears dreads. Now, this is a very bizarre situation. Everybody is a victim. Everybody is screaming. Everybody is crying. Now, here's the problem. Spare a thought for the victim, the real victim, who's trying to be heard in this theater of victimhood. Spare a thought for the guy who is really experiencing racism, really experiencing homophobia, really experiencing sexism, but cannot be heard because everybody is shouting that. Because if everything is racist, I'm afraid nothing is racist. If everything is homophobic, nothing is homophobic. If everything is genocide, then nothing becomes genocide. And that is the problem that we find ourselves in this country. Now, how do we get beyond this? I think a story that might help us is the story of Jonah, the biblical story of Jonah, which is a very amusing story. You see, Jonah is being called to minister to the people of Nineveh, to the Assyrians. But here's the problem. He hates the Assyrians. They are the arch enemy of his people. They have oppressed the Israelites for centuries. And now he is called to go and minister to them. And he's obviously a very reluctant prophet. And after a bit of a fishy detour, he eventually ends up there, and he becomes the most reluctant and most effective evangelist in human history. We are told the whole city repented from their evil ways. They all converted to God. They all changed their ways. And this greatly angered Jonah. He questions the justice of God. And there's a hilarious scene that happens in the last chapter where he sits on the east side of the city. He looks over the city in a hope against hope that the city will nonetheless be destroyed. And the conversation between him and God ensues. And God says, is it right for you, Jonah, to be angry? And he says, it is right. And he would rather die than live with the knowledge that his arch enemy, the oppressors, the Assyrians, would not be torched. Jonah is so blinded by his sense of victimhood. He is so angered that what he calls justice is in fact revenge. Nothing blinds us as much as a self-righteous anger fueled by a sense of victimhood. I want to finish this little argument by quoting a missiologist called Leslie Newbigin. He makes the following comment. He says, if we acknowledge the God of the Bible, we are committed to a struggle for justice in society. Justice means giving each his due. Our problem, however, as seen in light of the gospel, is that each of us overestimates what is due him compared to what is due his neighbor. If I do not acknowledge a justice which judges the justice for which I fight, I am an agent not of justice, but of lawless tyranny. I'm going to read that last bit again. If I do not acknowledge a justice which judges the justice for which I fight, I am an agent not of justice, but of lawless tyranny. So next time, before you take up a new cause on Facebook, Twitter, on the streets, wherever, just hesitate for a moment and consider, are you not a soccer player where there was very little contact, but you are falling to the ground, screaming to high heavens and trying to earn your side a penalty?